Well, good afternoon. I hope you had a nice lunch, but I hope I can keep you awake. The topic of my presentation is probably best illustrated by this slide, which includes part of an email message that I received from a parent. And I particularly like this slide because it's from a father, which is interesting. Most emails that I get from parents who are raising children bilingually are from the mothers, so it's interesting to get one from the fathers. But this, I'll let you read this, but this father raises a lot of questions which need answers, and it's trying to provide answers to these questions, which is the topic of my presentation this afternoon. So maybe I will read it. So he says, "The point is that my daughter has to speak 3, sometimes 4 languages simultaneously. My concern is how to not overload the child's brain, how to not cause a delay in her vocabulary development. Should we separate one language from another in terms of a territory or a time of use? Should we all switch to English while helping her to work on her homework? Is there such a thing as a right or an optimal way to raise a bilingual child?" And he raises a number of additional questions. And then at the end he says, and these are his words, questions, questions, and more questions. So this is, of course, for a researcher, this is like a gold mine because we try to answer questions as researchers. But this email is also very important because this father is reflecting a lot of the concerns that parents have when they raise children bilingually. But these are also questions that are relevant to educators who are educating children bilingually. So the research and the results that I want to share with you today are potentially answers to these questions. And the other motivation behind this research, just to describe this for you, is that many of our theories of language acquisition are based on monolingual children. In fact, if you look at the research on language acquisition, 95% of this research has looked at monolingual children. And yet, there's a huge proportion of the child population which is bilingual. In fact, it's been estimated that there are more children who grow up bilingually than who grow up monolingually. So if we are building a theory of language acquisition and we build that theory on the basis of data from monolingual children, we don't have all the data we need to build a theory. A complete theory of language acquisition has to take into account what we know about all language learners, both bilingual and monolingual learners. And when we look at only monolinguals, we're only getting half the story because these are children who are only learning one language. And what is true of children who learn one language may not be true of children who learn 2 languages. So we may be using theories for understanding bilingual children or for educating children bilingually that are not valid for bilingual children because they're based on data from monolingual children. And theories are important. Theories are important because they help us as educators, they help policymakers, they help parents decide what to do to help their children learn language. Theories are particularly important for professionals who work with children who have various kinds of learning difficulties, in particular children who might have a language impairment, children who might have a learning impairment, and we need to understand what is normal for a bilingual child so that we make appropriate decisions to help those children. And what's normal for a bilingual child may not be normal for a monolingual child, and if we're using monolingual norms, we may be misdiagnosing or misunderstanding these children, and we may therefore make decisions which are really not in their best interests. So there's important issues here when we talk about young dual language learners, and these are issues that have very real world implications: how to raise your children bilingually, how to educate children bilingually. But there are also these, as I mentioned before, these more general theoretical issues, which I'm not going to get in today. I'm going to really focus on these more applied issues. So what I want to do is, and my experience has been, after many years now working in this area, my experience has been that people's thinking about raising children bilingually or educating them bilingually in the school years is often motivated by informal theories which are inaccurate. In other words, when you look at what people believe about raising a child bilingually or educating a child bilingually, you find that those beliefs are not supported by scientific evidence. So this is why I've entitled the talk Myths and Misunderstandings, because a lot of common sense about bilingualism is really what we'd say in English horse sense. It really isn't right for the most part. So I want to identify 4 myths. These are the 4 myths I'm going to talk about. I want to explain to you what these myths are. These are not based on any academic analysis of anything. They're just my interpretation of what people are asking me about. And so I've classified them into 4 general questions, really. And so I want to try to explain to you what I think that the question is or the myth is. Then I want to describe to you what research actually says about those issues to see whether those beliefs are accurate or not. So very quickly, and I'm going to go into these in more detail in a second, the most prevalent myth, I think, that motivates many people's decisions and beliefs about bilingualism is what I would call the myth of the monolingual brain. And I'll give you more details about this in a moment. There's another myth about learning language in general, but learning 2 languages in particular, and that is when it comes to learning language, more exposure to language is better. And a corollary to that myth is that the younger you begin, the better. And so I'm going to talk about some research that actually looks at whether that's true or not. Another myth, which is very, very widespread, is that children are linguistic sponges. Language learning is very, very easy for children, and this is a particularly important belief within the education system, and it has important implications for how we construct school programs, curriculum, and so forth and so on. And finally, I want to talk about the myth that says children with learning challenges, and especially children who have a language impairment, should not be bilingual because they have an impaired language learning capacity, and learning 2 languages is beyond that capacity. Okay? So I'm going to tackle each one of these one at a time. So the first one is the myth of the monolingual brain. And I would have to say that many of the questions I get via email and when I'm at meetings with parents reflect this myth. And again, this is really not a scientific postulation. This is just my interpretation. And according to this myth or this belief, when children are born, they're clearly born with an innate capacity to learn language. And it's a unique capacity because no other animal species has the ability to learn language the way humans do. But this capacity is basically a capacity to learn one language. So so in other words, the idea here is that people believe that the language learning brain is really a monolingual brain. And therefore, learning one language is normal, it's natural, and it's highly successful. But the corollary to that is that learning 2 languages is beyond the natural capacity of the brain for language learning, and therefore it might result in delays in language development, it might result in confusion, or it might result in even deficits or impairment. So, another corollary here is that because children who are exposed to 2 languages are exposed to 2 systems, not one, it takes them, and because they're ready to learn only one language system, they actually treat these 2 languages as if they're part of a single system, and it takes them time to separate the input into different linguistic systems, and that's why you get this delay, and this is why you might get some confusion and possibly deficit, because there's additional tasks that bilingual children have to do that monolingual children don't have to do. So what does the evidence actually say about this? And I'm going to break this down into 2 or 3 pieces. I'm first of all going to look at whether, and by the way, I should say that as I go through this talk, there's different kinds of language learning situations I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about children who are raised in bilingual families, or multilingual for that matter. And I'm also going to talk about children who become bilingual because they're in a school system where education is delivered in 2 languages. So I'm not only talking about school-age children, but I'm talking about preschool-age children as well. And I'm going to talk about primarily children who are learning 2 languages, not children who learn 3 or more, although there are a lot of children around the world who learn 3 or more languages, but there's actually very little research on multilingual children. And a lot of that research is actually is more like case studies than large samples where you can make confident generalizations. I'm also going to talk about learning 2 oral languages and not a sign language along with oral language, although there are also bilingual children who know an oral and a sign language and they're bilingual, but I'm not going to talk about just because I don't have enough time. So the issue here is if children really do have a monolingual brain and learning 2 languages is more difficult than learning 1 language, we would expect to see that bilingual children who grow up with 2 languages will take longer to go through the milestones of language acquisition than monolingual children. So the best way to answer this question is to actually look at what are the milestones that monolingual children go through, and how do bilingual children compare when you look at the same kinds of milestones. So here are typical milestones for acquiring a first language. So these are children who are exposed to language when they're born. In fact, we now know from research that children begin to acquire language before they're born, because before they're born, even in the womb, they hear certain features of language, the intonation and the rhythm, which they actually learn before they're born. So when they're born, they're already familiar with the rhythm of certain languages, and the rhythm of other languages is actually strange to them. So the process begins very, very early. But these are the typical milestones that children go through when they're acquiring 1 language. So children begin to segment the speech stream into separate words. When children when they're initially born and they hear language, they have no way of separating the speech stream into separate words. It all is just one long continuous garble, sort of like listening to a language that you've never heard before. You can't tell where one word stops and another word starts. Well, it's the same for infants. And it takes them about 7 months before they actually begin to separate words from one another in the speech stream. Children then go through a stage of babbling, when they're not producing words and they're not producing the sounds of the language, but they're babbling in a way that actually has characteristics of the language that they're exposed to. Excuse me. And on average, children go through this babbling stage between 10 and 12 months of age. They then start to produce their first words around 12 months of age. So this is something that all parents expect, that their child will produce his or her first words on the first birthday. In fact, this is a very rough approximation. Some children produce single words before 12 months of age. Many children produce their first words after 12 months of age. But on average, it takes about a year before children actually start to produce recognizable words in the language that they're exposed to. Children then acquire words very, very slowly, and in the first from 12 months to 18 months of age, children learn only on average about 50 words during that period. It's very slow. Language acquisition, we think language acquisition is very efficient for children, but it actually is a very slow process. It takes children 12 months before they say anything that we can recognize. It takes them another 6 months before they know more than 50 words. At around 18 months of age, children start to produce understand and produce an enormous number of new words, and this is called the vocabulary growth spurt. And then at 24 months of age, 2 years, they start to produce simple sentences, and then they start to produce complex sentences. So you don't need to really know all those details, but what is important is that the age when children typically go through these milestones is fairly well known in the case of monolingual children. If a child who is hearing 2 languages from birth is really having to work harder to acquire those 2 languages, then you might expect the child to actually go through those milestones later than monolingual children. And in fact, the research that we have available at the moment says that in fact the milestones for bilingual children are exactly the same as the milestones for monolingual children. So despite the fact that they're exposed to twice as much input and they're having to learn 2 sets of vocabulary, 2 grammatical systems, their brain is sufficiently strong and powerful that it can do it in the same time frame, at the same ages more or less, as monolingual children. Right? Now, this is not to say that bilingual children are the same as monolingual children. So often there's the expectation that bilingual children, if they're unaffected or if they're not challenged by language learning, they should look exactly the same as monolingual children. And in fact, bilingual children are not the same as monolingual children. They can be equally competent in using their language, but when you look at their language skills very carefully, you find that they're often very different. And one of the reasons for this, which will be obvious to you probably already, or if not, once I explain it to you, it will appear obvious, is that when you think of it, monolingual children are exposed to one language in every situation, with the mother, with the father, with playmates, everywhere they go during the day, they hear one language, okay? Whereas bilingual children often will hear one language used by certain people, but not by other people. They'll often hear that language used in certain situations, but not in other situations. So for example, if the mother speaks one language and the father speaks another language, the child's exposure to the language, first of all, is divided over the day. It's not 100% of the day. And the time that the child hears one language may be restricted to the father, and the kinds of language that the child is hearing and learning is the language that the father's is using. So the father may use certain words, may talk about certain subjects, may use certain sentence patterns and so on, certain discourse patterns, which are unique to the father. And as a result, the child's competence in that language will take the shape of the exposure they have to the father. In contrast, the mother might be using language in a different way. She might be using different words, she's using different grammatical patterns, she's talking about different things. So the language that bilingual children are learning reflects the contexts in which they're learning the language, as is the case for monolingual children, but the difference is that bilingual children are exposed to 2 different contexts of learning rather than one. So as a result, their competence in each language is going to be different from that of a monolingual child because the context in which they're learning the language is different. So it's important that we understand that even though bilingual children can go through these developmental milestones more or less at the same time as monolingual children, and even though they may be functionally proficient as well as monolingual children, their language skills are not going to be identical to those of monolingual children because the context in which they're learning the language is quite different. I also need to point out here that all of what I've said about the milestones in bilingual children going through these milestones at more or less the same time as monolingual children is critically dependent upon not only the quality of the input that they get from people, but the amount of input that they get. So you can imagine within some limit, if children, say we have a situation where children are growing up bilingually in the home, how many of you are raising your children bilingually? Any of you? Only one person, okay. 2, okay. Well, let's imagine we have a situation where the child is growing up in a family where the mother speaks Spanish and the father speaks French, let's say. So if the child has only about 10% of his or her time during the day with the father, then the amount of exposure to that language is very limited. And in that case, you would not expect that the child will acquire native-like competence in the father's language because the child simply doesn't get enough exposure to that language. And there's a lot of concern about or questioning about what's the minimum amount of exposure that children need in a language in order to acquire native-like levels of competence in that language. Now, we don't know for sure, but we know, first of all, children do not need to have 100% exposure to a language to be native-like in that language, because lots of bilingual children are native-like and they don't have 100% exposure to each language because that's impossible. And it's been estimated by some researchers, that children may need between 40 to 50%, somewhere in there, of exposure during a normal day or week to a language in order to perform like a native speaker of that language. If the child has less exposure than that, then the child's competence in that language is not going to be native-like. But it's also interesting from this study, which is very interesting, that more exposure than 40 or 50% doesn't necessarily result in additional competence. So the general point that I want to make here is that other things being equal, bilingual children can acquire full competence in 2 languages. They don't need 100% exposure to each of those languages, but they do need some minimal exposure that may be as much as 40% if they're going to perform within the native speaker range. So the other interesting implication of this research, for those of you who are interested in theories of language, is that if bilingual children can do this with half as much exposure as monolingual children, then monolingual children may be getting more exposure than they really need. There's a lot of wasted time. And the bilingual kids are using that extra time to learn another language. Anyway, this is a really interesting issue, and we don't fully understand it, but it suggests that, in fact, monolingual children may get more exposure than they really need. Okay? Now, there's another concern which is related to this issue of the monolingual brain, and that is that if the brain is really monolingual, then what that means is that children are going to treat the input that they get in their 2 languages as if it belongs to a single language system. And for monolingual children, this is not a problem because they are only learning 1 language system. But for bilingual children who are learning English and Spanish or Spanish and French, the hypothesis here, and lots of people believe this, even researchers used to believe this, that during the first year or 2 of life, bilingual children treat the 2 languages as if they're part of a single system. And the evidence that people used to support this hypothesis was, and here's a quote. I like this quote. This may be difficult if English is your second language, because this is very old. This goes back to 1890, and it's very artificial in a way by 21st century standards. But this fellow is expressing a deep concern that bilingualism creates confusion. So what he says, if it were possible for a child to live in 2 languages at once equally well, in other words, if the child were exposed to 2 languages to the same extent, so much the worse. This would be terrible, he says. His intellectual and spiritual growth would not thereby be doubled, but halved. And the idea is that the child couldn't deal with this double exposure. In fact, it would slow the whole process down. And there it goes on to say, unity of mind and character would have great difficulty in inserting itself in such circumstances. So if you look at some early theoreticians on this topic, there was also the fear that bilinguals would be prone to schizophrenia because they have this dual input and they couldn't sort it out, okay? Now, I know that nobody here believes this, but it's surprising how many people do think that dual language exposure actually will create confusion because children don't know how to sort it out. And one of the things that everybody know, all parents who raise a child bilingually know this 1 parent, 1 language rule. How many of you have heard of this, 1 parent, 1 language? Okay, so the notion here is that when parents raise their children bilingually, each parent should use only 1 language. So the mother uses Spanish, the father uses French. And the reason why this is recommended is because it's thought that it will reduce the possibility of confusion, because children will be able to associate Spanish with mother and French with the father. There's a physical way of differentiating these two languages. In contrast, it's feared that if the mother and father are both using both languages, the child will get confused. Okay. So the question is, do bilingual children, and this stage of confusion is thought to occur only in the early stages of development, because clearly, as adults or as adolescents, bilinguals are not necessarily, they may be confused, but not because they're bilingual. But this is thought to be an inevitable stage in bilingual development because the brain is essentially monolingual. So the question is, what is the evidence? Now, the argument for this theory, and again, a lot of parents email me and say, should we only use one language each so my child won't get confused? This is probably the most common question I get. So this is still a widespread fear. You'll also, and the evidence that people use to support this fear or this hypothesis is based on code mixing. So all of you probably know what code mixing is. This is when you, everybody here is bilingual, I assume, because you understand English and you speak Spanish, and you all code mix, right? In your day-to-day lives, how many of you don't code mix? So you all code mix. Now we know so it's okay, right? But when it comes to children code mixing, people and teachers especially are often very fearful that this is a bad thing, that this is a symptom that the child isn't learning the language properly, the child can't differentiate the languages, they're confusing the grammar, they're confusing the words. And the reason they say that is because children engage in this kind of code mixing. And I'm sorry this is not very clear because the red is not very visible. But here's an utterance where a child is using English and French and says funny chien. Chien is the word for dog. So this is thought to be evidence of code mixing and of confusion because the child is using words from both languages in the same utterance, and you shouldn't do that. You should keep French separate from English or Spanish from French and so on, okay? And we've just seen that in some communities, code mixing is a very widespread phenomenon in adults, but it's often feared that this represents confusion on the part of children. So there's actually been a lot of evidence, a lot of research on this topic over the years, and I want to show you some of this evidence. This is the most data you're going to get, and I'm sorry that these numbers are maybe a little bit tricky. But we looked at, we had been studying bilingual children, simultaneous bilingual children for a number of years, and we had about 10 children we had been looking at for a number of years, and we had tape recorded them extensively. We had transcribed their language samples, and then we had fed them into a database. And we had 10 children and over 10,000 utterances from these children. And this is where computers are very useful. You couldn't do this by hand. In that corpus of 10,000 utterances, we identified 429. These were children between about 18 months of age and 3.5 years of age. So they're in the early stages of language development. And within that whole corpus, we had identified 429 utterances. This was only actually 4% of what they said. So right away, we know these children are not really confused, because if they were confused, they would be code mixing a lot more than this. This is really rather minimal. Anyway, we looked at these 429 utterances, and we wanted to see how often, when they mixed the two languages in the same sentence, that they confused, they didn't use the right word order. So I'm going to use English and French as an example. In English, the adjective comes before the noun, and in French, the adjective usually comes after the noun. It's a lot like Spanish. There are exceptions, of course. So when if a bilingual child is using an adjective noun in an utterance, then there's the risk that the child is going to say something that's wrong, either in English or in French. Because if you use the English pattern, then it's wrong according to French, but if you use the French pattern, it's wrong according to the English. I mean, another example with Spanish and English is, in Spanish, you don't have to use a subject pronoun if you know what the referent is. In English, you always have to have a subject pronoun. So when the child is talking about something, in English, you have to have a subject pronoun, and in Spanish you don't. So under the confusion hypothesis, you might expect that children will either drop the subject pronoun too much in English, or they will use it too often in Spanish, right? So what actually happens? Do children code mix in those situations when the grammatical rules of the two languages do not coincide, okay? Well, what we found, I should put up the other slide, is that if you looked at these 429 utterances, over 99% of the time that they code mixed, they only code mixed when the grammatical order was the same in the two languages. So they didn't mix when they had to use an adjective and a noun. They didn't do that because they would break the rules of either English or French, okay? 99% of the time when they code mixed, it was in a context where they would not violate the rules of either English or French. So they might say, I went au magasin, I went to the store, because the word order in English and French is the same. In English you say, I went to the store. In French you'd say, je suis allé au magasin, which is to the store. So you can say au magasin in English because the word order is the same, okay? So when they code mixed when the word order in the two languages was the same. There was less than 1% of the time that they code mixed where they broke the rules of French or of English, okay? So in effect, when they were code mixing, they were making sure they didn't do it in a way that would violate either the rules in English or in French. That's pretty remarkable, and these are children who are anywhere from 18 months of age to 3.5 years of age, okay? Nobody's taught them these rules, but they know them and they avoid breaking them. Now, so the question is, well, if they don't code mix because they're confused, because this previous evidence suggests that they're not code mixing because they're confused, because they're actually following the rules of English and French, right? So they know the rules of English and French, so there's no confusion. So what's going on? Well, one of the obvious reasons, which many of you may have figured out, is that they're code mixing because they don't know all of the words in both languages. So when they go to say something in English and they don't know that a word in English, when the boy went to say funny dog, maybe he didn't know the word dog in English, but he knew the word dog in French, so he decided to use the French word to fill in the gap, okay? He's in a bilingual family. It's quite likely his parents know the words for dog and cat in both languages, so he borrows the word, either the word dog from French, or it might have been that he knew the word dog in English, in French, but he didn't know the word funny in French, so he said funny in English. So the point, and so here's data from two very young children. These children were two boys, between 18 and 24 months of age, very young. This was an interesting study, but I'll just tell you that these children were in the stage before they show this vocabulary spurt. So they were just around the vocabulary growth spurt area where they had limited vocabulary in each language. And we were able to look at every time they code mixed, did they know the word in both languages? Or did they only know the word in each language? And so this is a word you know in both languages is what people call a translation equivalent. So if the translation equivalent of dog in French is chien, the French equivalent of cat is chat. So if the child knows both of these, then he has the translation equivalents. So we can see from Wayne's data that 90% of the time when he code mixed, he did not know the translation equivalent. So he used the word in the language where he did know the word in order to express himself. In the case of Felix, over 65% of the time when he code mixed, he did it because he did not know the translation equivalent, okay? So the reason why they're code mixing is not because they're confused, far from it. They don't know the word and they simply use the word in the language that they do know, okay? So in fact, rather than code mixing being a sign of these children's incompetence, it's actually an indication of their communicative competence because they're making themselves understood. Because they know two languages, they're using the resources of both languages, okay? So I'm not going to talk about the impairment bit now, but I'm going to talk about it later. But in contrast to this notion that bilingual acquisition, simultaneous bilingual acquisition, can result in cognitive confusion and delays, there's a lot of research that has been done in the last 10 or 15 years which shows the opposite, that there are cognitive advantages to being bilingual. And this is research which many of you may be familiar with, because it's actually, at least in Canada and the United States, there's been a lot of media coverage of this research. But just very briefly, sorry, I'm going to go back. There's a researcher in Toronto who's done a lot of this research, a woman named Ellen Bialystock, and she's shown that if you look at bilingual children and compare them to monolingual children, you find that the bilingual children have cognitive advantages in comparison to the monolingual children. And the areas where they show these cognitive advantages are in areas that are called executive control functions. So this is an actual area of the brain that's actually widely accepted now. It's in the frontal lobes of the brain, and it's like the CEO, it's like the chief executive officer of your brain. It sits at the front there, and it controls the flow of information, it controls your attention, and it tells you when to look somewhere else, it tells you where to focus your attention, what to avoid, and so on. So it's kind of like the master switch of your brain that helps you deal with complex cognitive problems. And what a lot of researchers now have shown is that bilingual children tend to have superior cognitive control functions in comparison to monolingual children. And the argument is that when children acquire two languages, they have to exercise a lot of executive control because they're hearing two different languages, they're having to use two different languages, and they're having to attend very carefully to what they're hearing and what they're saying so that they can understand things and so that they don't get confused. And they're, in a sense, it's like this control mechanism in the frontal lobe. It's almost like it's a muscle, and bilinguals have to really exercise that muscle in order to learn their two languages. And as a result, it becomes very, very strong. And it shows itself not only when they're involved in linguistic tasks, but also when they're involved in non-linguistic tasks such as spatial problem solving or music and so forth and so on. So there's a kind of spillover effect that this advantage is evident not only when they're processing language, but also when they're processing other kinds of complex cognitive material. There's been really interesting research that has been done by a researcher, Jacques Mehler, in Italy, that shows that even 7-month-old children who are exposed to two languages show these kinds of superior cognitive control abilities. So it's something that emerges very early in the process of acquiring two languages. So the reason I mention this is just a slide. I hate this picture. These are two little babies in a pail, but it was in the news story, and I wanted to put up a news clipping. But what's important about this is that, contrary to this fear that bilingual acquisition is a challenge and slows the brain down, there's growing evidence that, in fact, there are cognitive advantages which result from learning two languages. Okay, the second myth that I want to talk about, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, is the idea that when it comes to language, more exposure is important because more exposure results in greater competence in language. And as a result of and this is a very widely held belief, and it has a lot of very serious implications for children. First of all, as we saw in the case of simultaneous bilinguals, is that it leads to the expectation that simultaneous bilinguals will be less proficient than monolingual children because they have half as much exposure. And we've already seen that that's not true, that even with only half as much exposure, these children can be just as proficient as monolingual children. So right away we know that this is actually not a very accurate set of expectations. One of the other ramifications of this belief is that minority language children who grow up in a language, in a family where the language that's spoken is not the dominant societal language, but they have to go to a school where the societal language is used for education, that these children should begin to learn the dominant language as quickly as possible. and they should begin, and especially they should start to learn it before they go to school so that they'll be ready for schooling in that language. This is a very big issue when it comes to immigrants in Canada and in the US, where many immigrant parents think that they should begin to use English in the home before the children go to school so that they know English when they go to school. Now, that might make some sense, but the problem is many of these immigrant parents don't know English. So they're trying to use a language with their children that is not very sophisticated and not very well developed. So the children are being exposed to linguistic models that are really very limited. The other problem is that because the parents are trying to use a language that they don't know very well, they're unable to socialize their children very effectively because they're using a weak language. Imagine trying to socialize your children to be a good person using a language that you don't have control over. So as a result, these children often are alienated from their parents. They're embarrassed by their parents because they don't speak English. And when they do speak English, they don't speak it very well. Another implication here is relevant to foreign language education, and that is that often there's the belief that because more is better and earlier is better, that foreign language education, even for majority language children, should start as soon as possible so that we can provide children with more exposure. So in some countries in Europe now, and I think this may be true to some extent here, everybody wants to learn English and they want their children to begin to learn English as soon as possible under the assumption that the earlier they start, the more exposure they have and the better they will be. Okay? So some of this has a kind of common sense merit to it, but the question is it really supported by research? Now, it turns out this is a very, very complex question with no straightforward answers. And the notion that more is better and earlier is better when it comes to language learning, especially second language learning, it doesn't hold up insofar as there's no simple correlation between amount of exposure in language and how proficient you are in that language. All right? And I want to show you the complexities of this situation. So we've already seen that it doesn't hold up. There's no simple correlation between amount of exposure and language learning and simultaneous bilinguals. But what about the case of children who are learning a second language in school, which is closer to the situation that you face every day? So in the school setting, at least in Canada and the US, this notion that more is better is usually talked about in terms of time on task. The more time we spend on a task, the more time we spend teaching certain skills, the better children will be. So, and this is the rationale for much of what we do in school. So we begin to teach math early, we begin to teach reading and writing early, we begin to teach science early because we think that these are important skills for children to learn, so we need to start soon so that we can give them lots of exposure, okay? But is that necessarily the case? I mean, it actually is good because it justifies what we do as teachers, because that means that everything we do is important, and the more we do it, the better. But is that really true? So I'm going to show you some data that comes from various kinds of bilingual programs that show you the complexity of this issue. So here is data, and you've seen some of this yesterday. Here's a scenario where time is not critical for language learning. So this is a typical early immersion program that we talked about yesterday. These are English children in a French language program. They get everything in French initially and then some English. And when you look at these children's English language skills at the end of grade 5 or grade 6, you find that these children do just as well in English as children who have been in a program that's entirely in English. So even though these children spend the first 3 or 4 years of their schooling in another language, it doesn't have a negative impact on their English. This is remarkable. So there's no real relationship between how much English they get and how good they are, okay? Here's another situation. This is from a different context. Mimi's going to talk about this tomorrow. Again, where time doesn't seem to matter. So this is a program for Spanish-speaking children. These are Spanish children at home. They are minority language children. They go to school, and rather than being educated in English, their initial education is in Spanish, So this is the converse of what I just said for the children in Montreal. They get native language instruction initially, and then they get English language instruction later on. So they get much less exposure to English in school than Spanish-speaking children who go to an all-English program in the United States, which is the typical school program. But when you compare these children and you look at their English in comparison to the English of children in an all-English program in the United States, there's no difference. So despite the fact that these children get much less exposure to English in school than the children in the all-English program, they do just as well and better, actually, than children who've had 100% of their education in English. How can that be? It doesn't make sense. Now, one of the reasons, I'm going to come back to this later, but one of the reasons is related to the status of the languages, okay? Now, there are cases when time does matter, and I'm going to use the same programs to illustrate the situation where amount of exposure does have an impact on language proficiency. So if you look at the French language skills of immersion students, so French is their second language, you find that students who are in an immersion program where they get more exposure to French do better than immersion students in a program where they get less exposure to French. So there, more time does matter. Similarly, in the United States, the same bilingual programs we just talked about, if you look at these children's Spanish language skills, again, Spanish is the native language, the more exposure to Spanish they get in school, the better they are in Spanish. So in one case, time matters, in Spanish or in French, and in the other case, it doesn't matter, and that's English. What's the difference between these two languages, these language scenarios? Status. So in the one case, English is the high status language, and they're exposed to English extensively outside school. And in other cases, French and Spanish are low status languages, and their time does matter in school because when they're outside school, they don't get much exposure. All right? These are just news clippings that are intriguing that shows that the status of a language is very complex. So here's a situation where Hispanic parents in the US are discouraged from using Spanish with their children because it's going to threaten the harmony. Immigrants must learn English or country will suffer in the long run. But here's a case where very wealthy English-speaking parents in New York City hire nannies who speak Spanish because they want their English-speaking children to learn Spanish. So you can see that as an immigrant parent, this would be terrifying to think that you're destroying the country if you use Spanish. So anyway, we could go on and on about that, all right? Here's a case where less exposure matters, just to make it more complex. This is early immersion, which you've seen. This is late immersion. So these are students who begin French immersion in grade 7. The point here is that the students in this program get much less exposure to French than the kids here because they don't start until grade 7, all right? When we compare these two groups of kids on French, the French language skills of these children are often as good as the French language skills of the children who start early and get much more exposure. These children often have 3 times more exposure to French than these children, but they do just as well in some cases. Not always, but often, okay? So they're getting less exposure and they're doing better. This doesn't make sense. What's going on? Well, obviously time is not the explanation because the kids who are doing better get less exposure. But what's probably happening is the kids in the late immersion program are doing just as well in French as these kids because by the time these children get to grade 7, they're fully proficient in English, and in particular, they're very literate in English. So learning to read and write in French is easy because they transfer a lot of the skills they've acquired in English to French. They can teach themselves how to read in French, actually. And so a lot of the academic language skills they need in French here, they've already acquired in English, and so it makes the process much more efficient, okay? This is just a study, and I probably don't have time, but this is interesting. To show you how powerful these cross-linguistic effects are, we looked at English-speaking children in French immersion programs. And we looked at them in kindergarten when they were 5 years of age. and we gave them a very extensive battery of English language tests. And we used those tests to classify the children as typically developing or being at risk for language difficulties or reading difficulties, okay? Using English, their native language. And then in grade 3, when they were in our French program, we looked at how well they were really doing in French. What were their reading skills like? What were their language skills like? And we classify the kids into students who were typically developing in French or kids who were behind in French. And we could predict with 77 to 80% accuracy which of the grade 3 students were behind in French, reading and writing and speaking, using their kindergarten English language results. So, and the reason I mention that is to show you how powerful these relationships are, okay? Okay, I have to move very quickly because I'm running out of time. There's the notion that, and maybe what I will do is I'm going to skip this one and go to number 4, because this is the one that I really want to talk about. The fourth myth is the notion that we talked a little bit about this morning, that children who have various kinds of learning impairments are not good candidates for bilingualism because it's more challenging. And these children are already challenged, and therefore they shouldn't be challenged by learning another language, and they shouldn't be challenged by learning through another language, which would happen if they're in immersion. So here's a psychologist who says, and I read this yesterday, my knowledge of the problematique was that leading me to believe that adding yet another language to a child having difficulty mastering his mother tongue could be putting the child at too much pressure and setting the child up for failure. I'm sorry, that's wrong. So there's a general notion that children who are challenged in school shouldn't learn another language, okay? So I want to talk in this case in particular about not the children I talked about yesterday, but children who have a specific language impairment. Because if anybody should have trouble learning a second language, it should be children who have trouble learning their first language. So kids with specific language impairment have difficulty learning their language, but they don't have difficulty learning anything else. So these are children, if you look at them when they're 7 and 8 years of age, they're not using language in the way that other children use language. They have problems with vocabulary, with grammar, with discourse, and so on. So it's thought to be hereditary, and it's thought to affect 6 to 10% of the population. So the question is, do these children have more difficulty learning 2 languages than 1? Because that would support the idea that bilingualism is not good for children with language problems. So we did a study where we looked at French-English bilingual children. These are simultaneous bilinguals. They were 8 years of age. They had a language impairment. They were diagnosed by a clinician as being language impaired. And we compared them to monolingual children in English who had a language impairment, monolingual French children who had a language impairment. Because the issue is, are these kids going to be more impaired than these children because they're learning 2 languages and they're only learning 1? And what we found, we were rather surprised actually, is that these bilingual children had the same severity of impairment and the same patterns of impairment as the monolingual children. So even though there is something wrong with the language acquisition device that these children have in their brains, it didn't stop them from learning 2 languages, and they were able to learn these 2 languages as well as children with language impairment who are learning only 1. So this really tells you how powerful this language acquisition ability is that children have, that even when it's not working at full capacity, it can still acquire 2 languages. I want to just briefly give you some more data on this because it's interesting. There's a study that was done looking at children with Down syndrome. And Down syndrome, as you know, is a genetically determined difficulty that children have. They have lots of cognitive problems, but they also have language learning problems. So this study looked at children who were bilingual in English and French, had Down syndrome, and they were compared to monolingual children with Down syndrome. And again, the question is, are these children going to be worse off than these children? And that they found is that they were actually no worse off than these children. These children are still struggling, but they're not struggling more because they're bilingual than the monolingual children are. So again, there's this evidence that these children have this incredibly powerful ability to acquire language, even 2 languages. And we talked about this yesterday, so I won't go over it again, that we know from research on immersion that children who have these kinds of have difficulties in school for these reasons, they do just as well in immersion as they would in a regular program, okay? Now, what's critical about all of this, and I want to end here, is that in all of these environments, whether it's a school environment with a child who has a difficulty, or whether it's a home language with a child with a difficulty, there's what we would call an additive bilingual environment. And this is and by this what I mean is that the people who are taking care of these children, the people who are educating these children, believe that these children have the capacity to learn 2 languages. So they give these children a very rich language learning environment, and this fosters their language development. And what's critical in all of these environments is that these children, for these children, is that they're in these additive bilingual environments. If children are going to schools, if children with language impairments are going to school and the teachers don't believe that they can do it, then these children are much more likely to fail, because the teacher, rather than giving them an enriched environment, is going to be diminishing their opportunities to learn the language. So the bottom line in all this, after many, many decades of doing research on this now, the challenge is for it's not a problem for children to learn 2 languages. They can do it without too much difficulty. Some children have more difficulty than others, but even children with difficulty can become bilingual. The challenge is really for the adults. The challenge is for adults to provide children with enriched language learning environments so that they can become fully bilingual, whether they're typically developing or whether they have these kinds of learning challenges. So I'm going to end there because I've run out of time. Thank you.